you've worked with so many bands, and like most of them are real legends of metal and rock music. But I think not all people realize that actually one of the very first your contribution is on the first album of Slayer, and you were like a teenager. You were just a little kid, teenager when you
Right.
worked with Slayer. You worked as a roadie for them, right?
Well, I suppose, I mean, I was at that time, I was their light person, and I was just their lighting kid. And this, this was before there were any lighting packages, like where it's like you're involved in this big old lighting package. No, man, it was just like, it just started off by I would go to all the Slayer shows. They had a following of about 30 people in Los Angeles, very dedicated following. But at that point, they were too heavy for the LA Rat, Motley Crue, Wasp kind of crowd that was, all those kind of bands that were playing the LA scene, all these Van Halen-y sounding pop bands. Slayer was just too heavy for that. So they had about 30 people, and going to all their shows, and I was one of those kids, me and a couple of buddies usually. And I remember, I was pals with the guys, just they were, bands were very easily approachable in the clubs. If you saw a band you liked on stage, go up to them afterwards and go, "Hey man, I like your band. I thought you guys were pretty good. Well, hey man, we're having a party tonight. You want to come over to the party?" Sure. Go over to the party. You get to know the guys, and then all of a sudden you've exchanged phone numbers, and now you're pals. That's just kind of how that worked. And so I showed up to a Slayer show, one of their shows in the middle of the week, and I remember Tom had just, he was like, "Hey man, the guy that does our lights is not going to be here tonight. You see that board over there? You think you can go, can you handle that light board?" And it had like 8 buttons. It was about the size of an iPad. There was nothing I was like, "Yeah, sure, I can handle that." So, punching the buttons for Slayer. The next week at their next show, because they were playing 3 to 4 times a month at that time, sometimes on Thursdays, on Wednesdays, on Saturday, just all over the place. And so the next week at the next show, he's like, "Hey, same deal. Our guy isn't going to be here. Can you do that again?" And I was like, "Sure." So, different light board, different club, but I started doing the lights. And then it just got to the point where I would show up at the shows and go right to the light board and do lights for them. And I was like 15, 16 or so. And so when they went on the road a few months later, I was out on the road with them. But they had invited myself and my buddy Joel down to, they were tracking Show No Mercy. And, we were down there for a few of the sessions while they weren't in the studio all that long with it. And I remember that when it was time for Jeff and Carrie to do their vocals, because there's probably some YouTubes of them doing Evil Has No Boundaries back in the clubs in '83 kind of thing. It would be Jeff and Carrie on a couple of mics, and live it was always like, it was like, "Evil, my words defy evil." It wasn't really like very forceful, And so I just happened to mention to Carrie and Tom, who were both sitting on the couch there, I was like, because Carrie and Jeff were about to go and do their vocals. I was like, "Hey man, you guys ever thought about like maybe just, getting a gang of dudes in there and everybody going, 'Evil,' big gang chorus or something?" And they looked at each other like, "Great idea. No time like the present. All right, everybody get in the vocal booth, sing Evil." And so that's how that worked out, So I got to be on the second thrash metal album ever. How cool is that? And that little concept was my little concept too. So, man, I always knew I'd have an impact on metal, and from that day on, I sure did.
You were there from the beginning. And is it true that Tom Araya had to convince your parents to let you go on tour with them because you were so young?
Yeah, it wasn't like really a convincing, really, but he did have to go actually, like ask their permission. I remember him, like I said, he told me, I didn't even know it happened. I wasn't around when it happened. And yeah, he was like, I had to get your parents' permission because, you were a minor, you're about to hit the road with us. So, I had to go talk to your folks. And then, you know, they had hung around my house. You know, my dad and Tom had a number of conversations, you know, from time to time. They'd been to my house a time or two. So, so yeah, I'm sure my folks were like, yeah, take the kid, you know, take him, get him out of here for the summer. Totally. So that's pretty cool.